Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans. I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for almost 25 years and was introduced to the practice during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and a raging panic disorder that had blown up into agoraphobia. So I was on disability. I couldn't go to work. I couldn't leave my house. And happened to get paired up with a psychologist who was several decades deep into practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation, even back in the mid to late 90s. And that was my introduction to this practice. As some of you know, no one was more surprised than I was when it actually did something and helped, and actually started helping very quickly for me. And I think part of that was because I had no expectations for it. Almost a quarter of a century on, here I am still practicing, teaching, and here I am. And thank you for being with me. This is the next in our ongoing series of calming anxiety by living mindfully, where I share some of the techniques that I have had shown to me, that I have discovered for myself, and I have found personally helpful on my journey. So let's jump in, okay? As always, let's begin by imagining that we are suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of our heads. As a nice cue to sit up straight, without adding any extra tension to do so. If we are experiencing some tension right now, mental tension, physical tension, emotional tension, that's completely fine. That is allowed here. I've found that the natural tendency when we're experiencing some kind of tension is to try to get rid of it. And how do we try to get rid of it? Well, we try to force it away. And what's required for force? More tension. So, trying to force tension away is just bringing more tension to the tension that's already here. That's, in my experience, not very effective for getting rid of tension. So if there's some tension here, it's enough to simply notice, oh, there's some tension here. And that's really all we have to do right now. The tension can be tension. The tension can leave in its own time. It may or may not be today. And let's also notice what is beneath us. What is supporting us? A chair, a cushion, a floor. So there's a sense of grounding. Even if we don't feel particularly grounded at the moment, there's still something holding us up. And the same way we can allow tension to be tension, we can allow what is supporting us to support us. That's all we have to do. So let's take a moment to notice the feeling of what is supporting us. And this gentle suspension from the ceiling above us. And whatever else happens to be in between the two for us right now. However it is. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. And notice if your breathing changes when bringing attention to it. It's very common for us to begin to control or shape the breathing in some way when we bring active attention to it. There are some practices where we do deliberately control the breathing. This is not one of them. The same way that we can allow tension to be tension and see what it does. We can allow support to be support. See what it does. We can allow the breathing to be the breathing. And see what it does. If you're noticing controlling and shaping of the breathing, we can also notice the controlling and shaping of the breathing and simply see what that does. The same way we don't need to bring tension to tension in an attempt to get rid of tension, we don't have to bring controlling to our controlling in an attempt to get rid of controlling. That's not going to work either. But we can just watch and see what happens. Now, it's interesting to notice when talking about experiencing tension, trying to get rid of it, experiencing controlling, trying to get rid of it. Experiencing anxiety, trying to get rid of it. It's like we have these conflicting voices inside of us. I always get this mental image of a round table. There are all these different voices meeting at this round table. And maybe one of them is saying, I need to control the breathing because it needs to be a certain way. Maybe it's saying, oh, well, you're not a good meditator if your breath isn't long and deep and contemplative, right? Perhaps there's another voice saying, well, you need to control the breathing because you don't want it to get too fast. Because there was a time in my life when breathing too fast signified I could be having a panic attack. So that was unacceptable. But then there's this other voice saying, well, no. We shouldn't be controlling the breathing. And then maybe there's a fourth voice saying, will you three guys shut up? Right? So right there's already four voices, and all we're talking about right now is the breathing. So with everything we have going on throughout the day, internally or externally, you can see how this meeting at this round table can get out of control very quickly. So what do we, as presumably the leaders of this meeting, what do we do? Well, we very often try to shut out the voices at that table that we don't want to hear from. Do they go away? Not in my experience. If somebody shows up to a meeting every day and is constantly told not to speak their piece, they're probably going to start to try to talk louder, more often, more insistently. Not because they're a jerk. It's actually quite the opposite. They're trying to help. Every voice at our internal round table is trying to help. They're just each coming from a different, limited vantage point. Usually one based on fear. Which means usually what they're suggesting, usually what they want, isn't necessarily the most skillful or necessarily effective course of action. But we can still listen. And we can acknowledge them. And say, oh, I hear you. And I see where you're coming from. But we have a greater vantage point. We can see where all of the voices are coming from. Because they're all us. Even the ones that are arguing directly with each other are actually all on the same side. Ultimately, they're all on the same side because they're all us. They all want the same thing. They want us to be safe. They want us to be happy. They're just going about it in different ways because of their limited vantage points. I found that as I allow each voice to speak its piece, acknowledge it, a funny thing happens. I often feel gratitude for that voice. Thank you for trying to help in the best way that you know how. The only way, perhaps, you know how. I can breathe and pay attention and listen. Doesn't mean I necessarily act upon what that voice is suggesting. But I can make space for it. And even if that buys me nothing else, it's still better than fighting with it. There's always going to be inner voices to fight with. But do we have to? No, we don't. In my experience, they're not here to fight. So why are we bringing a fight to them? So, like with tension, like with the support beneath us, like with the breathing itself, we can allow each voice at this table to speak its piece. And see what happens. As you go throughout the rest of your day, notice what comes up. Notice what voices arise. Notice our reaction to the voices that arise. Notice our usual way of handling the voices when they arise. Notice what happens when we listen. Not obey, right? Not obey. Listen. Without interrupting, without arguing. What happens when we let those voices say their piece? And perhaps even offer our gratitude to them for doing so. in my experience, simply listening and seeing what happens. Are a huge part of making our way on our path. Thank you, everyone. I'll hang on for a couple of moments if anyone would like to share any questions or observations in the chat. Yeah, Michelle, nice observation there. So many voices at once, and that's part of what makes it so difficult. It becomes so cacophonous, right? In my experience, a lot of that is simply because of the way we've been handling them for so long. As I mentioned, if we don't let someone at the round table speak, but they have to be there anyway, and they're very motivated to speak, which all of the voices are, because they're trying to keep us safe and happy. I mean, what bigger motivation is there than that, right? If we've been ignoring so many of these voices for so long, then yeah, there's going to be, a shit ton of them all trying to talk at once. So what you're noticing about having trouble focusing on just one, that's, in my experience, that's an effect of not allowing them to speak for a long time. So at first, it can become challenging for that reason alone. So it's one of those situations where it's hardest at the beginning, I think. We need to get over an initial hump and perhaps develop strategies to try to notice one at a time. Or if it's simply really just too much, then sometimes we simply notice the cacophony. We simply notice, okay, there's a whole bunch of voices going on at once. Some of them talking about different things, some of them arguing about the same thing. And okay, this is what it is right now. If it's not proving fruitful to try to force, right? There's that tension again, that force. To try to make it so we can just focus on one of them. Because again, just trying to focus on one of them means what? Trying to shut down all of the other ones, which is what got us here in the first place. Just let them go for a bit. Again, we're not obeying them. We're just watching and say, all right, look at this mayhem, huh? Usually what keeps it going is that interference and that attempt to try to stamp it all out. As we talked about in our session last week with the sediment, sometimes we just got to step back, let it settle on its own, which it will eventually do if we stop interfering. So sometimes we just let the cacophony be cacophony until it kind of fizzles itself out. But yeah, it's a good observation. All right, I think I will wrap it up there. Thank you so much for being with me. Cheers, everyone. Take care.